The marketplace of ideas. It's a market where you get your ideas. To some, it's a metaphor that epitomises the virtues of freedom of speech and inquiry. To others, it's a laughable simplification used to justify corporate lobbying and the interviewing of cranks and racists. The set of values the metaphor summarises is simple, that all ideas should be heard because the best ideas, the most rational ideas, will rise to the top. According to scholar of the First Amendment C. Edwin Baker, the marketplace metaphor is the dominant rationale given for freedom of speech. Although not as old as the Bill of Rights itself, it's been used for over 100 years since Justice Oliver Wendel Holmes Jr. used it in Abrams V United States in 1919. He said that the ultimate good desired is better reached by free trade in ideas, that the best test of truth is the power of the thought to get itself accepted in the competition of the market. There are many critiques that could be made of the marketplace metaphor, and what's presented here will be necessarily limited, but taking a look at the concept philosophically, while exploring some pivotal moments in the history of the press, should serve to highlight where the metaphor fails, and what a more accurate metaphor might look like. The metaphor is a reasonably clear one. It assumes a market, through which a rational actor can wander, appraise ideas offered to them, and select the ones they like best. The most obvious point to make is that the metaphor idealises both the marketplace and the individual as neutral, that all goods are placed in the market equally and pros and cons listed without bias so a person can rationally decide that X candidate or policy is logically superior and should be selected. Furthermore, each individual is equally rational so as to be able to competently and informedly choose between the ideas leading to an optimal result overall. This, I believe, mostly has to be assumed by advocates of the marketplace metaphor for it to be effective, and neither of which, quite clearly, are true. First, the arrangement and position of the ideas in the market is not representative of the idea's true worth. It can be. Good ideas are often more palatable and so naturally have a place of prominence in contrast to terrible ideas, but the ideas are always arranged economically and socially as well. A terrible idea can be given a better position in the market, right next to the entrance with a big stall and a sign and flashing lights, just because the dealer has more money than the seller with the great idea that has to have a little lemonade stand at the back by the trash. We could also argue that social factors, racism and sexism for example, have an effect on who gets to hustle the loudest and who gets pushed to the back. But there are also more nuanced ways in which the market gets ordered. In fact, any real understanding of the ordering of any market would have to look at its history, its plans, how it started, who was involved. In The Media and Public Life, a History, historian John Nerone argues that histories of the press shouldn't be approached as straightforward histories of journalism, but as a history of journalism as a set of practices that's better thought of as networks of relationships bound up with other processes, organisations and institutions. Approaching the press from this perspective avoids a singular teleological history that emphasises a path from the invention of the printing press to an increasing amount of liberal freedom in the 20th century. If we take Nerone's approach, there's no simple neutral public sphere in which information flows, but interconnected, competing, growing and dying public spheres which shift and change over time. The other organisations, institutions and the practices of the press are tied up in and contribute to the shape and outcome of the information presented, the topics discussed and the makeup of the marketplace. The early press in America, for example, was bound up with and dependent on a revolutionary new postal system, and with networks of merchants and trade routes that required information about far-off places to do business in. The first newspapers were essentially newsletters of information for merchants. These newsletters were obviously meant for a tiny proportion of people. One example of how economic factors shape the flow of information is that in colonial-era America, the cost of shipping 3,000 miles to London was the same as the cost of shipping just 20 miles inland. In other words, information could flow much easier along certain pre-existing, in this case maritime, channels. News in New York was reprinted from London much easier than news from Boston, say. And colonial-era newspapers didn't so much represent public opinion, but represented the interests and desires of a clique of merchants, lawyers, politicians and clergymen, a tiny percentage of the population. After the Revolution, wary of the need for some kind of national unity, the government enacted the Post Office Act to join the country's cities. They also subsidised the cost of sending newspapers through the post office, while editors could exchange their newspapers for free, and this was a huge source of news. Editors in different areas would run each other's stories to fill the pages. By the beginning of the 19th century, the press had begun to dominate American political life. A new style of popular politics was emerging that required candidates to secure the support of different groups. Farmers, lawyers, artisans, planters, writers, priests, and of course, the press, promising to then secure the votes. Andrew Jackson's presidential campaigns are paradigmatic of this new patronage style of politics. He acquired the support of a number of papers who would make short, punchy editorial commentaries in support of their candidate. It's been referred to as the party press or the partisan press, and editors would even organise committees and rallies. Even the owners and editors themselves would refer to the system as the manufacturing of public opinion. One of the most powerful editors of the period, Hezekiah Niles, wrote that editors would divide the spoils of victory, more than 115 of them being rewarded with offices or fat jobs of printing, etc. Party editors defended their partisan press by arguing it was a rational battle with competing ideas. The best would simply win. This was the system, the set of practices, the network of relationships, the marketplace of ideas that made up political communications at the beginning of the 19th century. In considering how effective this system was, Nerone poses a simple test. How did the system fare with the most contentious issue of the day? Slavery. Because popular party politics has to secure a majority block of support across the states, any realistic candidate had, of course, to secure the support of the southern slave states. This meant that in the party press, slavery was practically ignored. Politicians adopted a mild position on slavery so as to attract support in the North and the South. Abolitionists were mostly met with violence, much of which was supported by mainstream politicians so as to garner support of the slave owners at the right times. That's not to say there wasn't an abolitionist press, Frederick Douglass's North Star being the most well-known example. It's just that in the marketplace of ideas, these publications weren't anywhere near as influential as the party press, the mainstream press, nor were their ideas adopted by the mainstream media. Slavery only became a dominant issue when new territories opened in the West following the Mexican-American War. Northern workers feared they wouldn't compete with Southern slave labour in the new territories, setting off a chain of events that led to the Civil War. As Nerone argues then, the party press, the 19th century marketplace of ideas, failed on the issue of slavery. Abolitionist ideas were excluded not because they were morally lesser, but because they didn't serve the utilitarian purposes of the party leaders and editors. Across the pond in Britain, the government had taken a different approach to the press. In 1712, the stamp tax was introduced for all pamphlets and newspapers. All publications were heavily taxed and printers had to register their names and addresses. Officially, the tax was effective. Smaller working and middle class and radical publications especially suffered. Ironically though, by printing illegally and avoiding the tax, smaller, sometimes radical pamphlets flourished. In this sense, the Stamp Act completely failed. Another irony was to come though. As the commercial press grew, advertising revenue became more important as a way to maximise that revenue, and expensive new production techniques like the steam press and the rotary press were introduced. The smaller radical publications were at an increasing disadvantage as their large competitors produced a bulk of flashier, larger, more populist content for much cheaper. When the stamp tax was finally abolished in 1855, large Sunday papers began to dominate the market. These papers were commercially monocultural, close to political and metropolitan elites, and filled with similar London-based news and commentary. With a small amount to spend on luxuries each week, the working classes took to this depoliticised commercial, entertaining content. The diverse regional political press shrank, and the abolition of the stamp tax put the smaller papers at even more of a disadvantage as the commercial papers grew. Historian Ralph Negrin writes that the Victorian era saw the commercialisation of the press, the effect of advertising, the trend to sensationalism, concentration of ownership, and the reduction of political coverage. Newspapers went from simple block reporting of events, verbatim reports of Parliament, etc., to big flashy headlines, sensationalism, giveaways, human interest stories, and gossip. Historian John Tulloch writes, to assemble mass readerships, the new press had to adopt the formula of the popular Sunday press and the burgeoning magazines. Mass readerships are essentially a coalition of different tastes, interests, and political positions. Newspapers had to be created that had something for everyone. The process pushed newspapers towards a consensus politics that aimed to maximise the audience. By the second half of the 20th century, political news was coming from just a handful of sources. There's a similar test to the American case we can apply here. Just as the stamp tax was being repealed in 1855, the Chartist movement was agitating across the country. The working class movement had a dynamic radical press and a mass of supporters demanding 6 things, 6 points of a charter. They were the vote for all men over 21, a secret ballot to avoid intimidation, no property qualification for candidates, a salary for MPs, equal constituencies for fair representation, and annual elections. Why is this also a good test for the marketplace of ideas? Because again, to our eyes, this is about as fair as it gets. All of these conditions have been met today, apart from the annual elections. But in their day, despite a popular press, huge demonstrations, marches and petitions, the Chartists failed. When matched with the increasing might of the commercial London papers, the Chartist press dwindled and died. Their little stand at the back of the marketplace of ideas was overshadowed by the huge stores right at the entrance. Now, admittedly, these two stories of the party press in America and the commercial conglomerates in Britain are simplified sketches. The press, of course, have had moments to be proud of, along with moments of shame. But telling these two stories, two central, fundamental stories to the 19th centuries that really set up our modern world, serves a purpose. Systems of information, packaged as they are by people in networks with values and connections and goals, are never neutral. Furthermore, they always have a history that shaped them in a particular way, for particular people. To our eyes, abolition and the vote are not exactly the most unreasonable of moral ideas, hardly ideas that need defending today. But if we adopt the marketplace metaphor, these ideas about abolition and the vote were sidelined because apparently they were either bad or irrational. Or is it only now that the best ideas rise to the top? Or is it that the marketplace improves over time as well as the ideas? Which leads us to another problem. The metaphor is one that relies on modernistic clichés like linear progress and increasing rationality. As Jared Schroeder has argued, this common modernistic interpretation of the marketplace should be supplanted by a discursive interpretation. Discursive meaning that knowledge isn't discovered in a rational, linear, progressive line of development, but the result of complex groups of people coming together in different ways that leads to a version of the truth emerging between them. Knowledge building is a collective endeavour, not one where individuals take part separately in uncovering the truth. John Milton, probably the first to argue for freedom of speech, wrote in Areopagitica that though all winds of doctrine were let loose upon the earth, so truth be in the field, we do injuriously by licensing and prohibiting to misdoubt her strength. Let her and falsehood grapple. Whoever knew truth put to the worse in a free and open encounter. Unfortunately, the truth is quite frequently put to the worse. Milton's metaphor about truth and falsehood grappling might be all well and good, as long as we focus on how the grappling takes place, under what conditions, asking whether those conditions are free and fair. There are other criticisms we could point to, that each person has fair and equal access to the market and can appraise the goods in a fair and equal way. The marketplace metaphor assumes honest actors, transparency, equality of faculties, of perspective, a fair and honest playing field, all of which, in reality, get distorted. This isn't meant as an attack on freedom of speech, it's just to acknowledge the field isn't a neutral one through which truth will simply emerge. Copyright, libel, regulations and education are all, in their ways, already restrictions on speech. There's no reason why corporate financing and advertising can't be regulated in some sense too. And it's not about regulating speech exactly, but being conscious of the ways and means it's transmitted. Voltaire said that I disapprove of what you say, but I'll defend to the death your right to say it. And it's possible to defend your right to say it while regulating the tools and means by which you amplify and proliferate it. The marketplace metaphor owes much to Adam Smith's analogy of the invisible hand of the market, that competing ideas based on individual people's self-interest will balance each other out. But as Robert L. Kerr has shown, even Smith acknowledged that the playing field had to be fair, and that the government had an important place in ensuring that it was. In his theory of moral sentiment, Smith himself wrote that a competitor may run as hard as he can, and strain every nerve and every muscle in order to outstrip all his competitors, but if he should jostle or throw down any of them, the indulgence of the spectators is entirely at an end. It's a violation of fair play, which they cannot admit of. All of these interpretations play into how free speech itself has been interpreted. There have been many Supreme Court cases over the First Amendment. In one in 2007, in trying to regulate political advertising during elections, the government argued that substantial aggregations of wealth amassed by the special advantages which go with the corporate form of organisation should not be converted into political war chests, which could be used to incur political debts from legislature. In 1990, the court did prohibit corporations from using their treasury budget in support and opposition of political candidates, while still allowing mechanisms for support through separate funds. This, though, was overruled by the Citizens United case in 2010, which ruled that corporation spending was itself protected by the First Amendment. Most of these cases have in some way revolved around the marketplace metaphor. All of this is not to say that it's not a difficult philosophical issue. Free speech is one of the most difficult, but it's damaging to base arguments on such fallacious, simplified ideas. What's more accurate might be something like the theatre of ideas, theatres that come together for competing reasons, sometimes economic, cultural, social, sometimes political, and always involve some combination of rationality and entertainment, flashing lights, magic and distractions, and are not always open to everyone, either to watch or to partake. The audience requires some understanding of the place and the issues the performance are coming from, and performers themselves obviously require special skills. Free speech is undeniably fundamental to a well-functioning democracy, but when it's oversimplified and used to justify extremist platforms and tidal waves of corporate campaign interference, the nuances that underpin the free speech argument deserve, at the very least, to be much more accurately thought about and represented.
I need your help, and here's my request. If you think you get the same value from 4 of these videos as you do from just 1 cup of coffee, then please consider pledging just $1 per video. That's $3 to $4 per month to keep this channel going. You can even limit your pledge to $1 a month, and if you pledge $5, I'll add your name to the credits. To those that already support Then and Now, thank you so much. This channel just wouldn't exist without you. You can also hit like, share, follow me on Twitter and Facebook, etc. All of these things really contribute to helping Then and Now grow. Thanks for watching, and see you next week.